Europe is facing a dangerous moment. Caught in a great power struggle, it did not start. The first signs came not with tanks, but with financial sanctions. China targeted a handful of small and medium-sized European banks. These weren't the giants of Frankfurt or Paris, but smaller institutions in Belgium and Luxembourg. A precise, deliberate message from Beijing to Brussels. The message: Europe's actions have consequences. For most Europeans, the news seemed distant, but in Brussels, it landed with force. This was no random act. It was a direct response to Europe's own sanctions on China. Beijing was showing it could weaponize economic interdependence, just as Europe once saw it as a shield. By avoiding major banks, China minimized global fallout but maximized anxiety within the EU. The move was a warning shot, not an all-out attack, designed to create division and force member states to reconsider their stance. Europe's era of comfortable neutrality is over. For decades, Europe believed trade would foster peace. Now that belief is being tested. China is no longer just a trading partner, it's a strategic rival. Beijing is signaling it won't accept Western pressure without response. Europe must now confront a new reality. Economic and foreign policy are inseparable. Every decision in Brussels risks retaliation from a global superpower. The landscape has fundamentally shifted. Europe's choices now carry global consequences. The question is Europe ready for this new era? This conflict didn't start with China. It began in Brussels, under pressure from Washington. The EU imposed sanctions on several small Chinese banks, accusing them of helping Russia evade Western sanctions. For the first time, Europe directly targeted Chinese financial institutions, a move long avoided to prevent provoking Beijing. The US has pushed Europe to align with its confrontational approach to China, seeing any support for Russia as strengthening its main rival. The sanctions were a gesture of solidarity with the US, but Europe hoped targeting smaller banks would limit the fallout. Instead, China saw it as Europe choosing sides in a global conflict. Beijing's response was swift and symmetrical, targeting similar-sized European banks. Europe wanted to send a message without starting a trade war, but now finds itself in a tit-for-tat exchange. The EU's economy is far more dependent on China than the US is. For many European nations, China is a top market and supplier. The pressure from Washington has created a deep dilemma: maintain the transatlantic alliance or protect Europe's own economic interests. Europe's calculated risk has backfired. China's retaliation exposes Europe's vulnerability. The EU is now caught in a sanctions war it can't win. The cost of following Washington's lead is becoming painfully clear. Europe's room to maneuver is shrinking fast. The story of Pirelli, Italy's iconic tire maker, is a warning for European industry. Chinese investment once fueled Pirelli's growth, with Sinochem as its largest shareholder. But as Italy's government shifted closer to Washington, it saw Chinese influence as a threat. Using special powers, Italy restricted Sinochem's role in Pirelli, citing national security. The move was political, a signal to both Beijing and Washington of Italy's allegiance. For Pirelli, this means uncertainty and risk to its access to the Chinese market. Beijing sees the intervention as hostile, reinforcing the view that Europe is an unreliable partner. The fallout damages not just Pirelli, but the reputation of European business. Many European companies have deep ties with China, now threatened by geopolitics. The push to de-risk from China often means real commercial losses. Companies like Pirelli are forced to weigh business decisions through a political lens. The cost of loyalty is becoming economic pain and lost opportunity. Germany's car industry is the most exposed to the US-China-EU tensions. German giants like Volkswagen and BMW depend on China, their largest and most profitable market. Now, that dependence is a liability. As Europe aligns with US policy, Beijing is encouraging Chinese consumers to buy local brands. Chinese EV makers like BYD and NIO are gaining ground, challenging German dominance. EU green policies add pressure, forcing German car makers to pivot to electric vehicles while Chinese rivals surge ahead. The irony: German firms lose ground in China and face new Chinese competition at home. US pressure adds complexity, with possible tariffs on Chinese cars and components. If Europe follows, Beijing could retaliate against German imports. The German auto industry is trapped, squeezed by competition, policy, and geopolitics. The consequences could shake the entire European economy. China's retaliation is a masterclass in calculated pressure. The sanctions on small European banks weren't angry outbursts. They were strategic signals. Beijing is making it clear it won't be a passive victim in this economic conflict. Europe's reliance on exports, especially to China, is now a vulnerability. For sectors like German cars and French luxury goods, the Chinese market is indispensable. Beijing's actions remind Europe that this relationship can be turned off at any time. The result? Deep divisions within the EU. Germany, built on exports, is cautious. Eastern Europe, focused on security, is more willing to follow the US. China exploits these fault lines, making EU unity harder. The retaliation is more than punishment, it's a warning. Beijing is showing that de-risking works both ways. If Europe reduces dependence on China, China can do the same. This could mean favoring domestic suppliers or penalizing European firms. A trade war would hurt both sides, but Europe may be less able to withstand the damage. The message: Europe's economic security is now at risk. Looming over all this is US politics and the possible return of Donald Trump. His America First approach treated allies as competitors, imposing tariffs on European goods. A second Trump term could bring even harsher measures, putting Europe between the Chinese hammer and the American anvil. The US is determined to protect the dollar's dominance, expecting Europe's help. By sanctioning Chinese banks, Europe reinforces the dollar-centric system, benefiting the US but straining ties with China. Europe is caught supporting a system that serves US interests while paying the price in its own relationships. Washington is preparing new economic weapons, massive tariffs on Chinese goods and high-tech components. These measures, aimed at China, would disrupt global supply chains that European industries rely on. A European factory might depend on a chip made only in China. US tariffs could make such components unavailable or unaffordable, hurting European production. Europe is being forced to choose sides, often at its own expense. The strategic trap is tightening. The cost of transatlantic unity is rising. Aggressive US economic policies could devastate Europe. A 60% tariff on Chinese goods would push Chinese exports toward Europe, flooding its markets with cheap products. European industries, already struggling with high costs and regulations, would be overwhelmed. Factory closures, job losses, and deindustrialization could follow. Strategic sectors like green tech and batteries could be wiped out before they mature. US tariffs on microchips pose another threat. Europe's supply chains depend on Asian components. A US ban or tariff could sever these links overnight, halting production in key industries. The result? A weaker, less competitive Europe, with higher prices and rising inflation. Industrial decline would fuel social unrest and political instability. Europe's technological capacity would erode, increasing dependence on the US or China. By following Washington's lead, Europe risks sacrificing its own economic future. The US reaps the benefits, while Europe bears the costs. The danger: Europe's industries could drown in the wake of US-China rivalry. Europe stands at a crossroads. One path: continued alignment with Washington, prioritizing security but accepting economic harm. The other: greater strategic autonomy, defining and defending its own interests, even when they diverge from the US. The middle ground is vanishing. Europe's current path provokes Beijing, threatens key industries, and creates uncertainty for business. The alternative requires unity, investment in defense, and technological sovereignty. The challenge: can Europe break the habit of following Washington's lead? Building a unified foreign and economic policy is daunting, but the cost of inaction is higher. Without change, Europe risks becoming a passive battlefield in a US-China contest. The future could mean diminished industry, reduced influence, and permanent subservience. The choice is stark sovereignty or a supporting role in someone else's drama. Europe must decide. Will it shape its destiny or let others decide for it? The world is watching.